Hey everyone, Heero here. Today we're gonna look at Heng Permansor Terrae, a unit that supports his party with attack scaling stackable shields and attack buffs while providing them with summons that enable big PP damage. I'll be discussing his kit, builds, Lightcones, and possible teams. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information shown is from the creator experience server, so things could still change when his banner drops. Let's start with his skill, Terra Omnibus, since it plays an important role in his bondmate mechanic. First of all, it designates the target of his skill as a bondmate. Just note, there can only be one bondmate present, and the status only applies to the most recent target of his skill. After which it provides every party member with a shield that scales off 400 plus 20% of Heng's attack for 3 turns. But the neat thing is, just like Aventurine, the shield is stackable, stacking up to 300% max shield durability, which is stronger than Aventurine's 200% max durability shield. This is all on top of it scaling off his current attack, meaning it's easily buffable in battle, so if you pair him with units like Kafka or Robin who has attack buffs, his shield will significantly get stronger. Now moving on, let's discuss bondmate by looking at his talent. When an ally becomes his bondmate, Heng gives them a summon called Soul Dragon, which has an initial speed of 165. And whenever Soul Dragon takes action, it cleanses 1 debuff from all allies while providing a shield that scales off 200 plus 10% of Heng's attack for 3 turns, with it also having a 300 max shield durability. But if the bondmate or Heng ever dies, Soul Dragon also disappears. It is very important to note that Soul Dragon counts as having a summon for the bondmate, which is insane since it allows any DPS, even those without summons in their kit, to take advantage of Sunday's full buffs. But I'll talk more about that later in the Synergies section. But let's look at his ult, which is a physical AoE that does a couple of things. First of all, it provides the exact same shield effect and max durability as his skill to all party members. Aside from this, it enhances Soul Dragon for 2 of its turns, giving it the capability to do a 2-instance AoE attack when it takes action. The first being a physical follow-up scaling off 80% of Heng's attack, and the second being additional damage of the bondmate's element, scaling off 80% of the bondmate's attack. Now his ult only costs 135 energy, so with an ER Planar and Rope, he is able to use it very often. And when combined with Soul Dragon's high speed, not only does it give him a pretty good attack frequency, it also enables him to be played in a more SP-friendly playstyle by only using his skill when you really need to, and instead relying more on Soul Dragon and this ult to refresh and stack his shields. However, the neat thing is, his A4 passive also perfectly goes in line with this. It advances his action by 40% at the start of combat, but the more important part is that whenever the bondmate attacks, Heng regens 6 energy while Soul Dragon's actions get advanced by 15%. This of course helps in getting his ult to refresh his shields and Soul Dragon attacks much faster, especially if you pair him with a fast attacking unit like Phainon. But let's move on to his A2 passive, which increases the bondmate's attack by 15% of Heng's total attack. This buff doesn't have a cap, so get as much attack on Heng as possible to help your DPS deal even more damage. As for his A6 passive, it enables Soul Dragon to provide an additional shield to the party member whose shield has the lowest durability whenever it acts. This shield scales off 5% of Heng's attack and has the same 300% max durability. Aside from this, when the enhanced Soul Dragon takes a turn, it deals another instance of additional damage of the same element as the bondmate, equal to 40% of their attack. So in total, one Soul Dragon attack will deal 120% of the bondmate's attack as additional damage, on top of the 80% of Heng's attack as physical damage to all enemies. And finally, for his technique, in the overworld, it dazes surrounding enemies for 10 seconds, rendering them unable to attack the active character. While in battle, it automatically designates the unit that started combat as the bondmate and uses Heng's skill once without consuming any SP. But with this kit out of the way, let's talk about his Eidolons. His E1 enables his ult to regen 1 SP every time it's used, while allowing it to provide the bondmate with an 18% ult-type rest pen buff, which is more damage for the bondmate, which is fairly simple. But of course, The extra bit of SP positivity is a great help in SP hungry teams like DOT teams, especially since he can use his ult very often. While his E2 increases the number of actions of the enhanced Soul Dragon by 2 for a total of 4. And after Dan Heng uses his ult, Soul Dragon gets a 100% action advance, giving it an instant turn. This is all on top of boosting the additional damage dealt by the bondmate and the shield that a Soul Dragon attack gives by 200% of its original amount. This enables more damage during Soul Dragon turns while also helping improve survivability. But the neat thing is, with his Eidolon, it's entirely possible to maintain full uptime of an enhanced Soul Dragon as long as you can get Dan Heng's ult back before all of its actions are up. As for his E4, it reduces the damage taken by the bondmate by 20%, which of course is pretty neat. And finally, his E6 gives a 20% damage vulnerability to all enemies while the bondmate is on field, while enabling them to ignore 12% of the enemy's defense. Aside from this, whenever Dan Heng uses an ult, the bondmate will deal 330% of their attack as additional damage to all enemies. This of course significantly increases Dan Heng's supportive utility, enabling more damage from both the bondmate and his ult. With our Eidolons out of the way, let's talk about Lightcones. Dan Heng's cool signature gives him 64% attack just by equipping it, while having a high base attack of 582. And whenever you use his ultimate, it restores every party member's HP based off 10% of Dan Heng's attack, and additionally restores 10% to the ally with the lowest HP, after which it grants all allies the redoubt buff, which is a 24% damage buff that gets boosted by 12% if they have a summon. So in total, this Lightcone gives a 36% damage buff to the bondmate. Overall, this Lightcone is insane for improving Dan Heng's supportive utility, giving him the ability to provide bigger buffs and heals for better survivability. This is all on top of giving him lots of attack to improve his shields and buffs while making him easier to build. I personally recommend going for this over his E1, especially when you consider he doesn't have a lot of good Lightcone options, since no other preservation LC gives a lot of attack. But with that being said, the best alternative to his signature is the BP's Journey Forever. Depending on the refinement level, it buffs his shield by 12 to 24%, while providing a 12 to 20% damage buff to the units that have his shield. Though it does have a few downsides. First of all, it's paid and it takes a while to get copies of, so not everyone will have access to it. Second, it has an incredibly low base attack of 370, so despite making his shield stronger, it causes him to give a smaller attack buff. Now there are other alternatives, the first of which is Landu's Choice, which reduces the damage it takes and makes enemies target him more, which of course is pretty neat for team survivability. And this is all on top of it having a decent base attack of 423, just don't use it in Phainon teams since you want them to be attacked. Red is also pretty decent if you're running him in a DOT or Acheron team for its additional DOT debuff. The only issue is that it has a low base attack. Gepard's signature works in the Kafka teams to help Dan Heng reach 75% effect hit rate to get Kafka's 100% attack buff to make his shield stronger in that team. And finally, any high base attack Lightcone like On the Fall of an Aeon, We Are Wildfire, or Wealth signature can work as attack stat sticks to help improve his shields and attack buff. Now if you're wondering if other Lightcones like Aventurines, the Herta Shops, This Is Me, or Day 1 can work, well, kinda. But they aren't the best synergistic options. Some of them can provide decent utility like Aventurines Lightcone or Day 1, but all of them are only focused on improving his personal survivability either by giving him more defense or reducing the damage he takes. The issue is, none of them really helps improve his shields or attack buff, and most of them have low base attacks. So aside from Aventurines or the Herta Shop Lightcone, I wouldn't really recommend using any of them. But with his Lightcones out of the way, let's look at possible relics. Now his best option for general use is Self-Enshrouded Recluse. It buffs his shields by 24%, while providing a 15% crit damage buff to all allies that have a shield. It's fairly simple, but provides good supportive utility. Its only downside is that it's from a new domain, so not everyone will have good pieces lying around, especially if you didn't roll for Evernight. So with that being said, another really good set for him is Sacridos, not only for its 6% speed buff, but to also allow him to give the target of his skill up to a 36% crit damage buff for 2 turns. It's a really good set if you're not running it on any other support in the team. Now yes, this set can stack twice, but most of the supports that use it, like Sunday or Bronya, are fully capable of stacking and maintaining the 2 stacks on their own. So in this case, it becomes redundant to have 2 of this set in a team, and it's much better for damage if you have Dan Heng with the Recluse set. But moving on, 2-piece combos of any speed or attack set can work as good temporary options to help you get the stats you need. So just use whichever one has the best substats. As for planar sets, its best sets are supportive sets like Lushaka for its bonus energy and attack buff for your DPS, Penacony for energy and to buff physical DPSs like Yunli or Phainon, Broken Keel for a party-wide crit damage buff, and finally Space Sealing Station for a massive 24% attack buff for Dan Heng to improve his shields and attack buff. Any of these can work as pretty good options, and it's entirely up to your preference. But my personal recommendation is either Penacony and Lushaka for bonus energy. But with his possible relics out of the way, let's talk about stats. He has a decent base attack of 582 and a low base speed of 97. Aside from this, he also gains 28% attack, 22.5% defense, and 5 speed from his traces. So make sure to consider all of that when building. For main stats, you want an attack chest, speed or attack boots, energy or attack rope, and an attack orb. Now for the chest and orb, attack is pretty much required to help him get lots of attack to improve his buffs and shields. As for the boots, speed is preferred to help him get lots of turns to generate SP and energy for his ult, while also giving him plenty of opportunities to refresh his shield with a skill if it's really needed. While for the rope, energy is the preferred option to get 2 to 3 turn ults consistently, which of course is great for allowing him to be less reliant on his skill to stack and refresh shields. But it becomes more valuable if you have his E1 or S1 and are running him alongside an action advancer. Cause with them, his E1 and S1's 3-turn buffs get consumed pretty quickly due to the amount of turns your DPS will take. So it's very important that you get his ult very quickly to refresh them. Now attack boots or rope can work if you really need stronger shields for harder fights like Lygus or Anomaly Arbitration, but just note, you will be sacrificing a bit of his utility by using them. As for substats, you only really need to focus on speed and attack first. Fairly simple since these are really the only stats he needs. But for stat goals, you can either go for 134 or 160 speed. Personally, I recommend 134 since you won't have to sacrifice a lot of attack stats to reach it. Cause with speed boots, it puts him at 127 speed, so you only need 7 speed from substats, after which you can just focus on attack. Plus it helps him get enough turns to refresh his shield consistently with a skill or generate SP or energy for his ult. However, if you're running him in a -1 speed setup, you can go for 136 speed instead, so he can generate SP before your DPS and action advancers rotations. As for attack, well, get as much as you can. There isn't really a cap to his attack buff, and his shields of course get stronger the more attack you have. But a good minimum to go for is 3,000 to 3,500 if you don't have a signature, and around 4,000 if you have it. However, the more attack you get, the better. But with his stat breakdown out of the way, let's talk about possible teammates. Let's first address the elephant in the room. Sunday is his best partner by far. Dan Heng giving summons to units enables just about any DPS that don't have summons to get Sunday's full 80% damage buff, which is insane. But aside from this, due to Soul Dragon being a summon, it will also be advanced when Sunday action advances the bondmate, making it really easy to stack and maintain Dan Heng's shields. Now there is a small issue with this however, in which it can waste the 15% action advance for Soul Dragon during bondmate hits. However, if you use an ult after an action advance, you can have Soul Dragon act first, and it'll still be able to benefit from the action advance during bondmate hits. Overall, this combo is one of the best pairings in the game, and is what I would like to call the wheelchair setup that is capable of carrying a lot of attack scaling DPS's damage. Now, he doesn't need Sunday to sustain a team. Without considering signature Lightcones or Eidolons, his permanent attack buff is enough to put him ahead of a lot of sustains, and this is on top of him being super SP friendly. You can use him in any team that doesn't break or doesn't need to lose or consume HP to function, so basically most attack scaling teams. First of all, his current best team is one with Anaxa. He's one of the units that really like to be ran with Sunday and doesn't have a summon, so he benefits greatly from getting Sunday's full buffs. But even without Sunday, Dan Heng is still his best sustain since he really appreciates his permanent attack buff. Compared to Anaxa's previous best sustain Huohuo, he prefers Dan Heng's permanent attack buff for more consistent damage, compared to Huohuo's 2-turn 40% attack buff, which gets consumed pretty quickly, especially if you pair Anaxa with an action advancer. Plus, Anaxa really appreciates Dan Heng's SP positivity since he does consume a lot of SP. And due to double skill procs, he is able to generate 12 energy for Dan Heng while advancing Soul Dragon by 30% for each of his turns. This of course gets doubled if you have Ceridra. Now Dan Heng is also a really great sustain for Archer. Emiya-san really appreciates his SP positivity and his permanent attack buff, which of course is rare to have in an Archer team. Again, this buff alone is enough to put Dan Heng way ahead of other sustains for Archer, except Gallagher, who does have better SP generation than Dan Heng. So it's really a debate on if you prefer more damage or more skills for Archer. However, this is without considering Dan Heng's E1, which does equalize their SP generation rate, which not everyone may go for, but it's still worth the mention. However, in terms of sustaining ability, Dan Heng is so much better, especially in harder content. Gallagher's healing mainly comes from your units hitting enemies. However, for supports like Sparkle who don't do that, it becomes harder to heal them without having Gallagher use his ult or sacrifice a turn to use his skill. This becomes an issue in harder content since this affects his SP generation, and he simply does not get his ult fast enough to keep up with how hard some bosses hit like Lygus. Dan Heng simply does not have this issue. He's able to keep your supports alive while still generating SP for Archer. Now let's move on to Phainon teams. He's very similar to Anaxa in a sense that he doesn't have a summon and he's a unit that likes to use Sunday, which makes Dan Heng a very good sustain for him. Dan Heng enables Phainon to get Sunday's extra 50% damage buff, and due to Phainon's trace, he gets another 45% whenever he's shielded, and an additional 10% from the Penacony set for a total 105% damage buff just by including Dan Heng. This of course is on top of his good attack buff. It is also worth noting that Soul Dragon also follows Phainon during his ult, which of course helps Dan Heng sustain him even further. Now this may all seem pretty good, however there are some issues to take note of. First of all, a third support is still better for Phainon's damage due to all the utility they provide, like Bronya's or Robin's action advances or Ceridra's double meteors, on top of all the damage amping buffs they bring to the table. Now this issue becomes way more evident if you don't have Sunday, where you'll definitely notice a big damage drop-off. Second, Dan Heng isn't really too good for generating core flames for Phainon, since the only way he can do it is by using his skill. This ends up making him as SP hungry as a support like Bronya or Tingyun, without the added support utility of an action advance or buffs from the SP that was spent, which of course can result in less core flames and harder SP management. And lastly, Phainon is fully capable of sustaining himself and keeping his team alive in most content, given you can generate core flames fast enough. So in his most damage optimized teams, he doesn't really need a sustain. But this can all change once content starts to get harder. Now, I just had to mention those issues for the sake of fairness, because despite all of them, if Phainon ever needs a sustain, Dan Heng will hands down still be the best one for him. And honestly speaking, depending on your investment, the main problem with Phainon teams is keeping his supports alive outside of his ult due to how hard enemies hit these days and their tendency to hard focus supports. So if you're running into that problem, just ignore all of the issues I just mentioned and use Dan Heng. In this case, Dan Heng will become more valuable than a third support, especially if you have better things to do than retry content over and over again. Dan Heng will guarantee comfier runs, and from testing, even without a third support, Phainon was still able to do decent damage and achieve relatively quick runs, especially if you have Sunday. Now you can also use him in Herta or Facial teams. Of course, they appreciate his attack buff and SP positivity. But the neat thing is, Facial's frequent attacks do end up generating a ton of energy for him while advancing Soul Dragon's actions by quite a bit. But more importantly, he also has a pretty good consistent rate of attack, which helps generate the relevant resources. But it becomes trickier once we compare him to other sustains. First of all, Aventurine has a faster rate of attack than Dan Heng, but his is tied to enemy count and enemy attack frequency, whereas Dan Heng's isn't. So when it comes to generating Herta's and Facial's resources, which one will be better will depend on the stage you're running. As for Lingsha and Hyacin, well, Lingsha has a faster rate of attack due to how her kit works, while Hyacin will only have a faster rate of attack at full ult uptime and if you only use her basics. So these two are better for resource generation. However, what Dan Heng has over all these units is his offensive utility, with his attack buff and pretty decent damage, especially if you consider his S1. And as an added bonus, he also enables Sunday to be used more effectively for these teams, especially Facial ones. Dan Heng also works pretty well in Saber teams. Just like Anaxa, she is also another unit that wants Sunday but doesn't have a summon. So he enables her to get Sunday's full buffs. This is all on top of Saber appreciating his permanent attack buff a lot, due to her taking many turns, making duration buffs like Huohuo's attack buff last an extremely short time. Now he does result in less ultimates compared to Huohuo or a Quid Pro Quo healer, since their bonus energy is something Saber really appreciates to help her get more ults. However, Dan Heng or other units that can frequently ult to generate lots of core resonances, combined with his offensive utility, especially with Sunday or a battery build Ting Yun, can help make up for it. But if you don't have Sunday, Huohuo is definitely the better sustain for Saber due to her bonus energy alone. However, if you don't have her, Dan Heng is definitely one of her best alternatives. Moving on, he also works in duo or triple DOT teams. His SP positivity is really appreciated with how SP hungry a triple DOT team can get, plus his attack buff does help with damage. The only real issue is that Dan Heng is a single target buffer. Isolants and their second DOT unit do end up contributing a ton to the team's damage output, especially when it comes to Kafka's detonations. So only buffing one of them isn't really too ideal. Now this issue is less felt in duo DOT since a lot of the team's damage mainly comes from either Black Swan or Isolants. But despite Dan Heng's utility, this team does still prefer Huohuo for her energy since they like to spam their ults often to maximize damage. However, out of all the sustains, Dan Heng is definitely the best alternative if you don't have her. As a side note, you can give him Trent to help Hysolent stack DOTs faster, and 75 effect hit rate to get Kafka's 100% attack buff to improve his shields for this team. Now for Acheron teams, again, he works pretty well in this team too. She appreciates his attack buff, and he can use the Tread LC or Aventurine's Lightcone to help provide debuffs for her. And again, he enables Sunday to be used more effectively with her, given of course your team can provide enough debuffs for her. But Sunday constantly action advancing her should help with that. However, even without Sunday, he can still work with her. The only real issue is that Trend has a low base attack, so his shields and attack buff does get weaker. Now comparing him to a sustain like Aventurine or an S1 Hyacin, Dan Heng will definitely provide less debuffs for Acheron, especially if you don't use the Trend Light Cone. But debuffers like Cypher with her S1 or Resolution, Pella or Silverwolf, and his offensive utility with his attack buff or signature can help compensate for this, so it's not too big of an issue. And finally, he does work pretty well with units like King Yuen, Seire, Dr. Ratio, Yunli, and more, who do like his attack buff and SP positivity, making him a really good sustain for them. Other attack scaling units can work with him too, but this video will get too long if I discuss all of them. But just note they can work. The only attack DPS he doesn't work too well with is an E0 Aglaya. Aside from her already being able to get Sunday's full buffs and her getting a ton of attack already, the main issue is Aglaya's energy problems, which Dan Heng isn't able to help with. She requires Huohuo or a Quid Pro Quo sustain to help her perform at her best and keep ult uptime, especially if you don't have Sunday. But maybe if we get another energy support in the future, it can enable her to work better without an energy sustain even at E0. Now, if you do have her E1, Dan Heng does end up working pretty well with her. This is due to her fast attacking nature, enabling Soul Dragon to act much more frequently while providing so much energy for Dan Heng. Now that's about it, which just leaves one last question. Is he a must-pull? Well, no, he's free. So I'll give my thoughts about him instead. I definitely think he is a great sustain. He has many team options, with him being able to be used with most attack scaling DPSs, making him a very versatile unit. Plus, he's free. And because he's a sustain with great utility, similar to Hyacine, Aventurine, and more, he'll be usable for a very long time, especially when paired with his Lightcone or Sunday. And did I mention, he's free? The only real issue I find with him is that he has a severe lack of Lightcone options that directly synergize with him. Hopefully Hoyo will release more, maybe through an event or something. But hey, at least he's free! Now, I've definitely been looking forward to him cause I'm a big Dan Heng fan. Look at our boy, he's finally grown taller. He's free by the way. But make sure to tell me what you think about him in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub. Now, onto the showcase. I hope you enjoy, and remember, I suck at this game.